Welcome to the Poetic Resurrection Podcast, where we explore perceptions. How self-reflecting questions can give you a better understanding of self. I'm your host, Sonia Iris Lozada. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Poetic Resurrection. And this month we have Hannah Parry, and she is the author of the book, Breathing for Both of Us. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really, really nice to be here. Thank you for letting me come on your podcast.
Oh, you are so welcome. I really would like to know more about the book. What prompted you to, because it's a medical book and you're talking about pharmaceutical companies trying to get something approved.
I trained as we call it here, a pediatric nurse. So it's a sick children's nurse. Mm-hmm. So the training in this country, you have to train slightly differently to, I'm sure you do in the States as well, to an adult nurse. And I worked in infectious diseases for quite a long time, up to the age of 16. And the patients up to the age of 16. And I had an idea of what would be like. I worked with a lot of, because it's infectious diseases, a lot of the children I worked with were really sick. They didn't necessarily die, but they would be terribly ill for quite a long period of time. So you would get to know them and you'd get to know the family, and they'd be with us for months at a time, and your lives would become enmeshed. And I got really attached to them. I couldn't help it. And I wondered what it must be like when, for us, we were really lucky in that pretty much 99% of those children would go home. But there was the 1% that wouldn't, and how that felt. And I thought, imagine if you were a doctor and you were fully responsible for the care of that child and something went wrong. So that character, the doctor character, sort of appeared. And then she had this kind of awful background. But at the same time, that had made her want to win this prize. She's up for a big prize with one of the pharmaceutical company, or the pharmaceutical company sponsors it. You know, they don't give the prize, they just sponsor it. So she has to walk a very fine line between doing something that's illegal, in that you're not supposed to give an unlicensed drug in this country to children, but sometimes you have to, because I'm pretty sure that's right. Don't all come for me if it's wrong. Pretty sure sometimes you have to, or what we would do often if a child was very sick, we would give much bigger doses of antibiotics and things like that, because they were very poorly and they needed that extra, that's what you would do rather than have them die. You would give them a bigger dose or something. So she comes up against that. She's in line to win this prize, but she ends up having to do something that is not quite right, and it doesn't work out in her favour. And then she finds out that it also hasn't worked out in some other children's favour either. And it's whether does she just keep her mouth shut and go with take the prize money and run, or does she find out actually what's going on? And that's what the book's about. And then plus all the sort of baggage that she has coming with her. Yeah, that's it.
So Hannah, how did you get started as a writer? And is this your first book?
No, it's not my first book. This is my third, it's sort of my fourth book actually, but number 3 didn't get published. I wrote 2 books for middle grade, so they're 9 to sort of 13-year-old girls' adventure thrillers. So I wrote for children initially because I think I like kids, obviously. I've looked at work with them, and so I started writing for children. So this is my first adult novel, shall we say. But it took me a long time to write. It took me about 4 years by the time I'd written it once and then rewritten it. I've got another adult book coming out at Christmas, and I ended up writing because both my parents were writers, which is sort of weird. It's not really weird, but they were copywriters. They were in advertising in New York in the 1960s and the 1970s. So, Mad Men?
Yeah.
That TV that was there. I didn't need to watch it. I did watch it, but it was all, I remember the sweaters and the pipe, and they all drank their heads off. And when I noticed I was writing. I always loved to read. I read a lot, really a lot when I was, I always have done for sort of escapism, really. And I noticed when I left home, I started to write in the back of my file of facts. Do you remember those? And the file of facts was that sort of address book that we used to have before computers, and it had note pages in the back. And I would go out, and I moved to the States actually when I was quite young, and I used to write a lot because I hadn't made any friends yet. So I used to just, I don't know, write rubbish really. But it wasn't until my mother died when I was 31, and then it became a lot more formal. And I think often writers, something traumatic has happened kind of propels you forward. So although I was fiddling around, I wasn't doing anything important. Well, after she died, then it all happened. And then I had my daughter, and then I did we call it a master's in creative writing. Mm-hmm. And I think you call it
it's a master's.
The MPhil. Yeah. Trying to think.
You have college, master's, and then PhD.
And then PhD. Exactly. That's it. Yeah. So I did the master's. And that was fantastic because that formalised my sort of education, because I wasn't very well educated before that. I was really naughty, and I stopped going to school when I was 14. And this showed me how to read the good stuff. So, and then how to learn to write properly. I think that was when I was about early 40s. So, yeah, I was really late to the table, as it were.
You know what? So was I, because I wrote a lot of poetry, but I never did anything with it. It would go in a drawer. It was my therapy.
That's it.
So I did nothing with it. And then I decided it was time I get over myself and publish.
Yeah.
Not how to re-edit, because my poetry was horrible.
I know my writing was terrible.
I don't know if you write like this, but when I write, it's subject, verb, because I'm just trying to get the emotions down. Mm-hmm. Is that how you write? How do you set up for writing?
Gosh, how do I set up? But I think subject verb is it really, isn't it? Because you've got to know who and what they're doing, and then everything else comes from that. So even if it's, when I first imagined this doctor character, she was terribly heavy and she was having difficulty getting her clothes out of the washing machine. We have front loaders here. So you have to bend down and you have to pull it all out. So that's exactly where I started. That's what she was doing when I first imagined her. So I think I probably follow that's probably exactly how that's how she starts, and then everything comes after that. I'm really bad at structure. So I like to structure first, if that makes sense, so that I know a little bit where I'm going, because I don't trust myself, I think. But I have to be, I don't know if you are quite disciplined about it, but I don't know whether poetry, or whether you are much more creative in that you wait for that poem to arrive.
Yeah, I do. When I think of a poem, and it usually comes through dreams and meditation, I think of a poem, I just need to get the emotion out. I don't care about grammar. I don't care about structure, because with poetry, it's the emotion that it has and how visual it can be. So then I go back and fix it.
Yeah.
And it needs a lot of fixing.
Yeah. Did you do lots of courses and everything, or did you just read a lot of poetry? And
I love poetry and I love short stories. So that's what I like to write, because that kind of like fits my attention span.
Yeah. I love short stories too. Yeah.
Oh, I know. Yeah. And you get like the beginning, the middle, and the end on an average of 10 pages.
Yes.
Yes.
And you can actually produce something and go, oh, I've finished.
Exactly. Because that's my thing. I need to finish. And I admire novelists. You are able to do the beginning, middle, and end in a couple of 100 pages. It's like, I wouldn't even know what to do with that amount of space in terms of writing.
Yeah, I know.
What is your procedure when you started? I know you do the structure. It's just amazing to me that you can take like a thought that's maybe a paragraph and make a whole chapter out of it.
Yeah. Yes, I know what you're saying. I think that's where the fuzzy area between allowing the character to take over, and me running along behind the character with my structure saying, no, you can't do that because you're supposed to be going to the bus stop. You're not supposed to be going down the road to see your lover. That's I know when the book is working is when those characters start to behave on their own. They start to, and I've been taught, the master, one of my tutors, he taught me, he said, if that happens, you leave it. Just follow them. Just follow them and write down what they're doing. So there's a lot of that in the process. So although I've got a structure where I say, I know that I need to get her from A to B, and I need her to be carrying an axe by the end of the chapter, quite how she's going to do that, I could almost leave up to the character. But sometimes that doesn't work. And I just have to force myself and sit down and say, you've got to do 1,000 words by lunchtime. So you better get on with it. And then I hate doing that. And I sit there really cross and sort of tight like this. But I find if I really force myself to do it, after about a few paragraphs, it will pick up, So that what I perceived was a block, it's not really a block. It's just me being cross because I haven't got a sort of really good idea at that precise moment. And it works out okay because I'm sure poetry's the same. I think I've got quite a lot of work subconsciously going on that I don't know about until it sounds really hooey. I don't mean it to sound hooey like that. But until I sit down and start typing, and then the things will come that I hadn't realised were there, actually.
Yes, that flow begins. When I'm stuck like that, I just stop. And I meditate because I find that creativity doesn't come up when you stress.
That's so true.
Creativity comes up when you allow yourself to just be. Do you get to the point at the end of, let's say, a chapter, where it's like you have to end the chapter, but nothing fits that you're working on? What is your process in getting out of that?
I think I just walk away and and be cross. I just think I just go, oh, I hate this, and just chuck it, and walk. I know this is a really big, because this is a thriller, and my 2 children's books were thrillers, and there's a big thing in the thriller. You're supposed to end each chapter on a sort of mini cliffhanger to make everybody want to read the next
chapter.
I find I can never, sometimes I can do it, but I can't do it. I can't seem to do it every time. I haven't got a good answer to that. I think I just look at that's probably when I go back to my structure and think, well, have I fulfilled what I needed to happen in this chapter? And if I have, I just think, okay, that's done. Go on to the next one and hope in the edits that I will have come up with something a little bit more interesting, because everything's changeable, isn't it?
You could make it a comedy if you wanted to. But I just learned something from you. I did not know that thriller chapter could end in like a cliffhanger. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I know.
Now I'm gonna look for that.
You're gonna be looking exactly going, that's not a very good thing. Yeah.
I took a writing class, and there's something similar. It's called IVing, just like you were a nurse. You drip information that applies to something later.
Oh, yes. We call that foreshadowing.
Oh, yeah. That
is the IVing, but I like the IVing because that's very specific, isn't it?
Yes, and that's what one of my writing instructors called it.
Yeah.
It is foreshadowing, but you're giving like a little hint.
It's smaller almost though, isn't it?
Yeah, and you could use it even in a name.
Yeah.
Like, I'm fascinated by names and colors and all of that and what they mean. So you can add that throughout, and if someone knows about colors or names, they can...
That's so interesting. So if it was a dark, I don't know, say you're writing something dark, you use dark names, dark colours. So you're sort of undermining it, or you're underlining the theme of the book in that way. Yeah, that's really clever, isn't it?
It's in a quiet way. You don't hit them over the head.
No.
I like my imagination to run when I read a book.
Yeah.
I don't want to be told. I mean, maybe the scenery, make it beautiful for me so I can see it. But otherwise, I want to kind of guess where you're going with it.
Yes.
And then at the end, I'm more surprised.
Yes.
Because sometimes it's not at all what you think it is.
Yeah. Yes. That's nice, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
And I think you get that more with when the writer can let the characters run off and do their thing, because the writer doesn't know what's going to happen. If the writer doesn't know, the reader will pick up on that and go, oh, I didn't see that coming, because the writer has also gone, I didn't see that coming either. Yeah.
Yes. I was writing a story, and I'm glad you told me that this is normal, that I let the character go, because I'm like, this character is going in a totally different direction than I imagine. So it's like, what's going on here? It's fascinating, though.
Fascinating process. Really fascinating. Yeah. I wrote a short story in lockdown, and exactly the same thing happened. This character, she came out of nowhere by page 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up calling the whole story it was all about her. I thought it was about the chap, but she was the driving force of it was extraordinary. So I ended up calling it The Matchmaker, and it was all about her in the background. So, and I think because it was lockdown, I thought, well, let's just let it run and see what happens, see where it goes, and it, I was really pleased with how I was so pleased I could do that. But I'm sure your poetry, is that how you write your poetry? When you've got the subject and the verb, do you then just wait to see what happens, or is it much more structured?
I do research on it, because sometimes, and I guess it's like dreaming, you think in surrealism, it comes across as kind of surreal. Mm-hmm. And so I need to bring it kind of down to earth to have the reader understand what I'm actually saying, because I think in surrealism. So my poetry is like that. It deals with psychology and dimensional things. That's why I write sci-fi.
Yes, that's it. That's it. Yeah.
Because I think that way, so like one of the things that I'm always like impressed, and I've interviewed other authors of novels, is like, I can't think that far ahead. I mean, to actually have that whole story, I get fragmented stories.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah. Very interesting, though. So, but you love science fiction. I think that's great. I've never met a poet who loves science fiction. I mean, I've met poets, but nobody who was ever writing science fiction poetry. Yeah.
It's funny because people say, oh, do you read? Because you should read all these famous poets. And I have.
Mm-hmm.
I read some sci-fi, not a lot of it. If it's a short story, I will read it because I know I'll finish it. But I read stuff like physics. I read nonfiction.
Yeah.
I read science. I read, I belong to space.com, NASA.com. I want to see what's happening in that world.
Yeah.
And that's what influences me with my stories. I try to find a kernel of truth that I can use in a sci-fi story, because I was told that fantasy is made up and that sci-fi is probable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, it's something that can happen. I mean, look at Jules Verne.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly.
Yeah, the submarine and airplanes, like 50 years before they ever were made or discovered.
Yeah, exactly. It's so interesting, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about Breathing for Both of Us and why it's called Breathing for Both of Us.
The backstory, the poor old main character, her name is Grey. And I didn't realise, I knew that Grey's Anatomy, obviously, I thought it was Grey's Anatomy because it was talking about the Grey's Anatomy book, which is Grey's Anatomy. And then I found out that that main character was also, I think her surname is Grey. So I hadn't, because I didn't watch the series because I was more of an ER girl. So
was I. Actually, I was on that show.
No.
I was on ER. Yeah.
Were you? Oh, who did you play? Really?
I was in a series finale with George Clooney. And it was like one of his last years, but it was the episode where his father dies. And unfortunately, he kills my husband in the process because, his father had a drinking problem.
Yes. That's right. Oh, it's all coming back now.
Yeah. I have no lines. All I do is cry for like 5 freaking hours that I had to do on the show.
Sort of in the background whilst...
No, I was still a principal character for the episode.
I'm going to rush off. I'm going to go rush off and find this episode immediately we finish.
Yeah. And I mean, it was like 30 years ago, okay? I had like a veil. I'm in church. And of course, being Latin, that gave me 6 kids, right? So I'm there with my 6 kids, and we're in the church. It takes place in a church.
Okay, good. All right, now I know where to look for you. Was it a nice set to work on?
Oh my God. Everybody, when I first went on it, was like, oh my God, you get to work with George Clooney. I'm like, yeah, well, he's good looking. I didn't think much of, but I would watch the series. I was so excited because it was my first network show, and I got to be on a show that I really liked.
Fantastic. Oh, I'm not surprised. Yeah, that's really something else.
I was totally impressed by George Clooney. The man reeks of charisma.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah,
very, very nice. It was a great experience.
Yeah.
But this is about you.
Sorry. So I didn't know it was. So poor old Gray. So Gray is the main character. She's the doctor, and her upbringing. She's been raised very poor family. Mum's an alcoholic. She's been brought up on what we would call a council estate. So she's...
what does a council estate mean for the USP?
On a council estate is where the government pays for your accommodation. She was being brought up in the 1980s. So then they were built post-war. So there was lots of places that were bombed. So they built these very tall estates full of, a bit like, the projects. And like the projects outside New York, right?
Yeah, the projects and that government housing.
Exactly. That's the same thing. So she's there, and her mother has another child, and basically Gray, who's very disabled, and she looks after her sister, and she loves her sister. But one of the things that's wrong, that's part of the backstory, is how this impacts her life, basically. And her sister has terrible asthma, awful. And eventually, that's something that will cause a lot of problems for her. So it's sort of her really saying that Gray, all through her life, she's breathes for both of them because her sister, who's called Hope, finds it very difficult to breathe. So she kind of does it for both of them. So that's just where it came from.
Is her sister... Well, I don't want you to give away the story.
Yeah.
I want people to go out and buy her book.
Go and buy it. You might want some tissues at the end. That would be my only... Yeah. But yeah, it's a funny title, isn't it? But I thought it sort of summed everything up. And I had just read something by Hilary Mantel, who writes historical fiction, and she had taken her title from a line towards the end of her book, and I sort of ripped off that idea. Basically, I copied her.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I don't think there's anything original anymore. It's just a different twist on it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we're getting towards the end of our interview. Is there anything you'd like to say to the audience? Any words of wisdoms, anything that you've experienced that you would like to share?
If there's people listening who, I'm sure there are people who want to write. I'm not a poet, but I do love writing. And I think if anyone wants to write, to just do it. I think that would be read as much as you can get your hands on of anything. It doesn't matter, fiction, non-fiction, but read in the area that you think you enjoy the most and that you think that you might want to write. It's good to do that. And then just sit down and start. And there's so many amazing resources out there now, writers groups, online writers groups, where you can sort of go on big Zoom calls and sit and write with other writers from all over the world. I think joining those is great for a beginner writer. So if anybody's thinking, I can never write, but I really like reading, or maybe I could write, I would say just go and do it, because if you read, I think you can write. That's what I think.
I think that's very true. The one thing that I learned from reading other people's works is that I learned new words and phrasing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I never thought of using something like that. And you see their style. I mean, you don't want to copy their style, because I think that as a beginning writer, I find you're too influenced by other people. You have to find your own voice.
Yes.
But that takes a while.
Yes.
And I think you're absolutely right. You just have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
That's right. I've known people that were gang members at one point, went to jail, and they are prolific writers now.
Sure, I'm sure, especially, I do think a sort of traumatic background sometimes do inform writers a lot. There's it's if nothing else, it just helps you to process stuff. You just write it for yourself. Yeah, that's what we're supposed to do, isn't it? Write it as if nobody was going to look at it, and then see where it takes you. Yeah, I think that's amazing.
Yes, and for self-publishers, do get an editor. You need someone to look at it.
For sure.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Many blessings, and I'll put all your information, because people have to buy this fabulous book. And thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Poetic Resurrection Podcast, available on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, and many other podcast platforms. Please visit us and subscribe to our newsletter at poeticresurrection.com for the latest information and updates.